We are back again. Another fun-filled episode on the Main Street Randyland YouTube channel. Hip, hip, hooray. You know, you get all the good stuff here. And I've talked about so many machines, and I've talked about fascination, but my camera guy says, well, I never really talked about this fascination. Well, I thought I did. Didn't I? I don't know. I thought I did. He says I didn't. Well, I don't know. Well, fascinations are a little different because they evolved over time, and there were actually a few different manufacturers and a few different manufacturing techniques. These tables are one of a kind. They're very unusual. Well, why would they be one of a kind? Well, I'll tell you. These are not really fascination machines. Well, what do you mean they're not? They're copies. And to make it even worse, they're copies of bootleg fascination tables. What do you mean? And the bootleg tables that they're copied from were copied from other bootleg tables. What is all this bootlegger stuff? Well, I'll tell you. The company that made Fascination started in California. The prototype machines were made in California. They were commissioned to be made by the man who was inventing the game, by a company named Canon. It was an electrical engineering specialist company in California. And he contracted with them to make the fascination tables so that he could then apply for the patent, which he did in 1931. So in those early years, there weren't any fascinations that were being bootlegged, because there weren't any. But the prototype machines went to Coney Island. Coney Island was the mega place for amusements at that point. And all the big operators were there, and they eyed up the game, saw it was a good game, making a lot of money. So right away, you had people who were trying to knock it off. And probably already into the mid-30s, they were making knockoff copies of Fascination. And they got sued by the Fascination Company. It was patent infringement. So the machines that were already out there, when they lost the case, had to pay a royalty to Fascination, and they had to change the mirrors so that they were circles because they used stars, calling it a 5-star final. And then they were legitimate. Okay. A man by the name of Florimont. The family got into the fascination business, and he had 2 sons, Eddie and Walter. And they were both taught by their father electronics, and they worked with games, and they got in with the fascination. As Walter told me, he was going to buy the fascination game from Olympic Park. He wanted to go into fascination business there. That was Irvington, New Jersey. So he was telling a friend of his in Long Beach, New York, how he was going to buy out the fascination at Olympic Park. And the man said, why are you buying that? You should buy this one. Walter didn't know it was for sale. So he ended up buying the fascination in Long Beach Island. So now he had to build tables for Olympic Park. So he used the tables from Long Beach Island as his template to design and build replicas for Olympic Park. He made some changes to it, like the head of the machine, where he made the head a head for 4 instead of using single heads on a section of 4, because he saved on the price of molding. That was actually the reason, he told me. But the circuits inside, he copied from the ones in Long Beach Island. The ones from Long Beach Island were bootlegs. They weren't original fascination tables. So the tables that he copied to put in Olympic Park were copied from the bootleg machines. Kind of an odd story, it just happened that way. So there's certain differences that I, as the engineer, understand because I've worked on fascination machines and I've worked on bootlegs, and there are certain differences that are evident to me. My opinion, the fascination machine company was superior in their design. The other company got around it, made it work, just not as efficiently. How does that pertain to these tables? These tables came from Olympic Fascination here in Wildwood. Well, Olympic Fascination in Wildwood came to Wildwood after Olympic Park closed. So when they came to Wildwood, they carried the name and they called it Olympic Fascination because people who played Fascination by them at Olympic Park knew them as Fascination from Olympic Park. So suddenly they came down here and here's Olympic Fascination. Walter came down to Wildwood. Eddie, when Palisades Park closed, he went to Seaside. He became Lucky's Fascination. That's where I learned to play. Eddie's the one who threw me out when I was a kid for winning too much. Walter, down here in Wildwood, he had a stronger business clientele following here in Wildwood than Eddie did in Seaside. By the beginning of 1970, Olympic Fascination was the place. It was busy. Every night during prime time, between 8 and 10 o'clock, you couldn't get a seat. You would stand in line waiting for somebody to stop playing a game or two and say, "Are you done? Can I get this seat?" It was that busy. They started with 40 tables that they brought from Olympic Park. They built 10 more and made it 50. They were doing well. In 1979, there was a fire. Burned down the entire block of 24th Street where Olympic Fascination was. Oddly enough, in 79 is when I started in business in Keensburg Amusement Park. I started with the Kentucky Derby. At the end of the season of 79, I was supposed to take over the old Kessel Brothers Fascination. I remember well, it was a Friday night and it was raining all day and night. Keensburg Amusement Park, business was shut down. There was no business. There was no point in opening. So I said to my mother, let's ride down to Wildwood and go play Fascination. We love to play. Even being in the business, we love to play. So we rode down. It was almost 3 hours to ride down here. Got down here. It was late. It was about 10:30 at night, but Fascination would still be open. Came up 24th Street, and when we pulled up the street, the block looked dark. And I was like, I can't believe that they would be closed. It was raining here too. Came up the ramp, came around the bend to find the whole block was dark and black. And there was plywood placed up against the burned out building. The fire had happened the night before. The block burned down. Fascination 2. And it was an odd story because as we're standing there in the rain in disbelief with our mouths hanging open that Fascination burned down, there was a carcass of 4 tables that had been pulled out of the fired, burnt out building, and it was leaning up against the plywood where the doors were originally to enter Fascination. So you knew that's where Fascination was. There were these burnt tables. And we see in the shadow of the eaves of the burnt out building a silhouette walking along. And it was coming towards us. And as it got closer, I said, "Marty, is that you?" It was Marty Shapiro. He was Walter's partner. He was the one who ran Olympic Fascination. He was walking in the rain. He was wet like a drowned rat, walking in the shadow of the burnt out building in the eaves. He didn't know we were there. We just happened to be there and he showed up. And we said, "What happened?" Of course, he said, "It was a very tragic thing. Doing my Marty imitation was very tragic. The whole block burned down. Happened last night." You could see he was hurt. He loved Fascination. I was hurt. I love Fascination. What could you say? We had our pleasantries and, wished them the best. If there was anything we could do, call us. We drove home. On the way home, I said to my mother, we just bought these tables from Kennywood Park. And we were going to put them into the Fascination in Keansburg because Kessel was moving out and we were taking over the spot. So we had just bought these tables. Maybe we could go in partners with Marty and Walter with these tables instead of putting them in Keansburg and rebuild Fascination in Wildwood. I had no way of contacting Marty. I didn't have his phone number. So the next day was Saturday. I did not open the Kentucky Derby. I got up early and I drove down to Wildwood. I got down to Wildwood around noontime. My goal was to find Marty. Came up the ramp to ask where's Marty, and they had folding tables all lined up in front of the burned out building. They were having a fire sale. All the boys who used to work at Fascination were standing there selling merchandise that they had, probably from other businesses too. I can't imagine any merchandise was salvageable from that fired building, but they were having what they called a fire sale. Asked where's Marty, he was over there, we got him to the side. I brought pictures. Marty, we drove down just to talk to you. We just bought these tables from Kennywood. We're supposed to put them in Keansburg. We don't have to put them in Keansburg. Does it make sense? We could be partners, use these tables and rebuild Olympic Fascination. Marty said, and rightly so, that he owed allegiance to his partner Walter. That if Walter wants to rebuild, he has to do it with Walter. But he added that Walter already said he doesn't want to rebuild. And Marty said, if Walter will not rebuild, he says, I'll do it with you because I want to rebuild. But Walter has to have the option. Great, fine. That's only fair. So we exchanged phone numbers, showed him the pictures. I rode back and I opened the Kentucky Derby later that afternoon, Keansburg. I never heard back from Marty the rest of the summer. So at the end of the summer, I took over the Kessel Fascination and I was in Keansburg. Although I didn't use those tables. Kessel ended up not selling the tables he had to somebody else, and now I had to buy Kessel's tables instead of just taking over the location, so I used Kessel's tables, so now I had 2 sets. So I assumed Marty was going to rebuild over the wintertime with Walter, and the word through the grapevine was that Walter was going to build the machines, and he was going to build them better than they ever were before, to show his skills and expertise in engineering. He was renowned in the industry for being able to build machines. Well, I'm new in the business, 18 years old. I just turned 19 that October when I took over Kessel's Fascination. It was actually on my birthday. That was the first day of operation on a Sunday. Each year, the New Jersey Amusement Association has an annual dinner dance. It's a promotional to raise membership and funds for the association. And that year it was going to be held in Atlantic Highlands, which was near Keansburg. So the owner of Keansburg Amusement Park came to all the people who were running games in Keansburg, and he wanted everybody to go to this dinner dance to make a big impression of all the people from Keansburg, a big showing. So we went. It was the first time we ever went to one of the New Jersey Amusement Association annual dinner dances, and we became members of the NJAA. And it was quite a thrill because at this association dinner, which was like a big wedding banquet hall, all the big shots that we knew from being players all the years were there representing their boardwalk areas, Seaside, Wildwood, Ocean City, Atlantic City. All the big players were there, people who I knew and looked up to. And here I was now, proud to be an owner myself. Well, the tables were round, set up like a wedding. And I was at one of the Keansburg tables, and my seat at the table was to the side that when they did the announcements, I had to actually turn my chair sideways to look at the stage. Right behind me was a Wildwood table. Wow. The big shots from Wildwood were there. I saw Walter was seated at the table behind me, almost in the same position of the table that I was. But he was looking across at me, and my back was to Walter while I was sitting at the table until I turned my chair sideways. Also at the dinner was Wally Kreisberg. We all looked up to Wally in Keansburg because he had Bev and Wally's Sportland and the drugstore, and he was related to the Bakermans who used to own Herman's Amusement Pier in Point Pleasant. So we all looked up to Wally because here we are in Little Keansburg. We know Wally, but he's a big shot. And Wally didn't sit at a Keansburg table, of course. He sat at the Wildwood table. He didn't want to sit with us at Keansburg. Seated next to me was Anthony from Pizza Villa. He was a little older than me, young man, early 20s. And he knew Wally. And apparently, Wally had tried to offer Anthony a place, a location to open in Wildwood, to leave Keansburg and go to Wildwood with his pizza business. So, before the stage show starts with the announcements, Wally comes over, he's talking to Anthony next to me. And Anthony says to Wally, you know, Wally, I just don't think in those kind of numbers. The rents are so high. You know, I know the numbers I do in Keansburg. There's no way I could pay those rents. You know, and Wally's telling him you're going to make a lot more money in Wildwood and you're going to make more profit even though the rent is higher. Anthony says, I'm afraid, Wally, I just don't think in those numbers. Wally says, Anthony. You should take a lesson from the guy sitting next to you. I'm like, how did I get in this conversation? Wally says to Anthony, the man's business in Wildwood burns down. The next day, he rides down to Wildwood. He wants to be his partner. And you're afraid to go down to Wildwood. So Wally knew the story that I rode down to see Marty. How did he know the story? I didn't tell anybody the story. It was the topic of conversation at the Wildwood table behind me. Walter was telling the story. Walter was pissed at me because I came down to try to horn in and be Marty's partner. Walter didn't want to build new fascination tables. He was already a very rich man, been in the business a very long time during the years of high profitability. But he wasn't going to allow Marty to reopen that fascination with somebody else. Out of, I guess, pride. So instead of going to his boat in Florida and spending his winter on his yacht, he spent the winter in the cold in Wildwood building new fascination tables for Olympic. And he was going to make them better than ever before with something never been done before. So now comes the spring, and the new Olympic Fascination is going to open. And finally it's revealed what the new feature is that's going to astound everybody. An optional 4 corners. where on command, the operator can turn on the four corners as an extra way to win. Four corners were never a way to win at Fascination. It was always 5 in a row. So now you were going to have the option that you could run a special by turning on the four corners so you could win with 5 in a row, or you could get the four corners. Never been done before. On these brand new tables, a new innovation. Having pride myself, I installed four corners optional system on my 1938 tables in Keansburg. And I did it in a couple weeks. So now, the big new feature for Wildwood with the four corners on the brand new tables, my old tables in Keansburg did it too. Unheard of. Olympic had a lot of money. I was just starting out, I had nothing. I couldn't buy a relay. Sounds crazy, right? I was a kid out of high school. I had no money. My parents put up the money to buy the businesses. It wasn't a fortune, but they put it up. They didn't have a lot of money. A relay back then cost about $15, $20 in 1979. That's like $150, $200 today. Parts have gone down since then, but back then that's what it cost. I couldn't buy relays to do all kinds of upgrades in my systems. I had to work around it and do it in ways that I didn't need extra relays. I added an optional four corners by adding no extra relays into my Fascination. None, not even one. It's crazy how I did it, but I did it. Because I had to do it that way. I had no money. Okay. With all their money and the powerful business they had at Olympic before it burned down, they wanted to build the Fascination back exactly as it was, so that people who didn't know that there was a fire would come and not ever even know there was a fire. That's an astounding feat, and they did it. They custom made the tables with cabinet makers who copied the burnt out carcass of that set of four that was pulled out and propped up against the wall. And they made identical duplicates of the tables that burned down. So people say, how old are these tables? These are the tables that were built in 1979. They look older than they are, but they look like 1950s, early 50s, because they were built to be identical as the ones that were built in the 50s. And the ones in the 50s were custom built, so there's no other tables that were like them then, and there are no other tables that are like them now. And they even went so far as to copy the way the system works. Even though they copied the bootleg system from Long Beach Island, when they built them in Olympic Park, they copied it again and redid the bootleg system, which was not as good as the Fascination system. And I recognized it immediately when I finally got these tables and worked on them and realized what they did, because I've worked on Fascination tables and I know what's what. It's odd that I ended up with the very tables that were built to spite me in 1979. Well, how did I end up with them? When I was in Wildwood, I came down to Wildwood, I brought my seaside tables. And I added some tables from Dorney Park. And that was Flipper's Fascination. Then when I was in the mall, I used Hershey Park tables. I have other tables. Tables that did things that these tables couldn't do, because I engineered further than Walter ever did. While I was at the mall, Olympic Fascination went out of business. Almost 50 years they were there. Quite a long run. They had change of hands a few times. In the late 80s, early 90s, the partnership of Marty and Walter separated. Everybody thought Marty was going to take over, but Marty's the one who left and Walter took over. So it was a change of operation then. Walter had several managers working it. It didn't work out. He had different ones. The last 10 years that Olympic Fascination operated, Walter had sold the business. He owned the property, so he sold the business and he became a landlord of the property collecting rent. So Olympic Fascination was not being run by Walter at all, although Walter was certainly around and gave his opinions and advices. Who owned it? Sean and E.J. Doherty. They had worked for Marty at Fascination when they were little. They worked there when they were really too young to work there, but they worked there and they were good workers. And they learned the business. And they eventually got into the business. And they had help with Marty. And they ran water games as they got older and different things. Well, eventually, they bought Olympic. It must have been quite a milestone triumph for them to buy the place that they started working at as kids, their first jobs. Amazing. So they certainly knew the game, they certainly knew the operation, but things weren't the same in 2005 as they were in 1980 when they were working there. Less clientele, expenses higher, income lower. And when Walter gave them the lease, which was not just Fascination, it was Fascination, the arcade, and the games in the front, it was a lot of money. The rent was a lot. When Fascination first opened and they only had Fascination, I think Marty told me they paid $4,500 a year. Imagine, $4,500. When Walter leased Fascination, the arcade, and the games in the front to the Dohertys, I believe it was $200,000 a year rent. A lot of money. So they came in with big ideas. They were going to try to upgrade things and regenerate, make more money. And they found that it really wasn't working. So after a number of years into it, now they figured, let's see if we can sell out. They had a 5-year lease with a 5-year option. So it was, I think, $200,000 the first 5 years, $225,000 the second 5 years. They were already into the second 5-year period. They couldn't not take the option because if they didn't, they'd have nothing to sell. They want to sell a business. They found 2 people interested in buying it. Steve, Lindsay, and Jared. Jared used to run the Greyhound Poker Palace a block away, which he had also bought from Olympic. He knew Wildwood. Steve, he was an operator. He put games around in different arcades in all different areas, different towns. Big operator. He had games in Wildwood also. He knew what the games were doing. He had them in with the Dohertys. They ended up making a deal. It wasn't easy. Marty really didn't want them coming in. Marty wanted to be a part of it, but they didn't want to be partners with Marty, and they were the ones putting the money up. So finally, Walter allowed the deal to go through. Sean and EJ sold out. Steve and Jared took over Olympic. They had the last 3 years of the lease. And they worked hard trying to make it work. But when you got a rent that's $225,000, that's an awful lot of money. You try to even make the rent, much less a profit. And you had to buy the business to do it. So when the 3 years were coming up, they said to Walter, look, we didn't make any money. We're not making money. We'd like to stay. Can you lower the rent a little bit so we can stay? They said, if you lower the rent $50,000, we'll try it again another 5 years to try to make this work. He wouldn't lower the rent. Walter said, if you're not making the money, it's your fault. Well, that's not always true. But that's the way he felt, and it's his building, and it's his choice. So he refused to renew the lease. They had an auction. Everything was sold. Everybody was there. Everybody was in the business. They were there for a long time, well advertised. I was there. It was a whole day thing. I bought a few things just for memories. The last thing they sold was the Fascination. The very last thing. I already made up my mind I wasn't going to bid. Because whatever I could bid, they could bid more. They have way more money than me. And it makes sense for them to buy it. They own the building. If you buy it, you can re-rent it as a turnkey business. It's there, it's established. Why wouldn't you buy it? Marty had approached me before the auction. He wanted to know if I would be partners with Marty. He's going to get the lease from Walter. He's going to buy the tables. And I would be partners with Marty to be the machine guy to run Fascination. I said to Marty, sure. As the auction was coming closer, I said to Marty, Marty, you have to have your deal made with Walter before the auction. Because if you don't have a deal, you can't buy the tables. He hemmed and he hawed. He said, well, we'll see, just pushing me off. I think that's what the goal was, to push me off. So they started the auction at Fascination. There was a bid from the floor. Nobody else is bidding. I was just rummaging around in the back. I wasn't even in the line with everybody. See, I was behind the auctioneer. I wasn't going to bid. And it wasn't like they said, going once, going twice, gone. This went on a half an hour. They had one bid, they're dragging it out, trying to get people to bid. Finally, I walked across the floor, right past the auctioneer, and I walked right over to Walter, standing there with Cindy and Marty, and I says, Walter, are you going to let this happen? Cindy yells at me. She says, he doesn't need this anymore. I said, Cindy, this was his life. Why wouldn't he buy it? It's here. It's set up. You can run a turnkey operation. You can rent it. Walter says, well, if I wanted to do it again, I could build new tables. I says, Walter, you're not going to build new tables for what they're selling it for. And it's here. It's already set up. People know these tables. There's a heritage. I says, Walter, bid. Bid. He says, I'll give it one shot. So he steps up with his finger in the air, and he outbids the other guy. As soon as he outbids the other guy outbids Walter. Walter wouldn't bid anymore. He was a very stubborn man with his ideas. When he made his mind up, that was it. And it got sold to somebody from the floor. We don't even know who. Marty's asking everybody, do you know who that is? Nobody knew. Marty went over to talk to the guy to try to find out information. The guy told him he was from Ocean City, Maryland. And they were going through a referendum there as far as poker machines is concerned. And he didn't know if they were going to be allowed to run poker machines anymore. So he wanted the Fascination as a backup. So if they had to pull out the poker machines, they could put in the Fascination. Marty said, that's true. They are going through the referendum. It made sense. So this guy from Ocean City, Maryland, bought the Fascination. I had tears in my eyes. I said to Walter, with tears running down my face, I said, Walter, I'm more upset than you. He says, no, it bothers me, but I won't let it show. I'm more the sentimental type. I let it show. And I says, well, Walter, I'm sorry that it ended up this way. And if there's anything I can do, let me know. You know how to call me. And that was it. That was the end of the night. I went back to the mall. I was upset. I got back to the mall. There were people playing Fascination. And I had to take over and run Fascination and put on the charm smile when I had just come from basically a funeral watching the death of Olympic Fascination. Well, everybody who bought something had only about a week to get it out, because the lease was coming to an end at the end of September, and anybody who bought anything had to clear it out of the building before the lease ended, because the building was going back to the landlord. Everybody was there. I was there after the weekend, so I missed Sunday, but I was there Monday picking up the stuff that I bought, and everybody else was there. And while I was taking apart the few things I got, an interesting thing happened. The owners, Steve and Jared, were going around telling everybody the double big giant crane that was in front became available again. Did anybody want it? Apparently, whoever bid on it at the auction, I don't know if they didn't pay the deposit. They paid the deposit, didn't complete paying the payment because you had to pay it in a certain period of time. I don't know what happened, but they defaulted and the machines were available again. They were going around asking everybody. They asked me, I said, I really don't have a place for it. I don't run cranes. But because I was friends with Ted, who had Sportland Pier, I had people contacting me, asking me to ask Ted if they buy the cranes, can they put it on the pier? And I explained to them that he might let you put it on the pier, but he's not going to say, yeah, go ahead, buy the cranes, you can put it on the pier. He doesn't work like that. It would be a last-minute decision in the spring. So supposedly somebody bought the cranes. The next day, they're available again. Whoever bought it didn't come up with the money. They're available again. I think that happened 2 or 3 days in a row. Finally, I'm feeling sorry for Steve and Jared. These two guys spent all this money to buy this business. They're losing their shirts, having to sell everything at auction. So I said, look, I says, I'll buy the cranes. He says, how much do you want to pay for it? I says, whatever the price was at the auction, that's what I'm going to pay. I wasn't looking to lowball them. I wasn't going to say even $1 less because now you can't get a buyer. I'm not looking to hurt you. I'm looking to help you. Whatever it was sold for, that's what I paid. And they appreciated that. And now I had to take them apart. And it took 8 hours to take them apart. It was a very hard job. They had built a shed around them. You couldn't get your hand on the top, and the screws were Allen wrench screws, and they had rusted, and they were stripping. Oh, it was awful. It took 8 hours. And where did I move the pieces? I moved them over to Sportland Pier because I had my equipment in one of the buildings over there already with Ted, so I just moved them over into the building. Never got to use them there, but I moved them over there. As I'm taking the cranes apart, Steve comes over to me and he says, the Fascination's available again, do I want it? Just like the cranes, whoever bought them, somehow or another defaulted on the payments, and they were available again. And I said, yes, I'll buy them. And I had to go immediately to the bank and get a bank check for the full amount and bring it back to hand it to Steve. And I did that. Within an hour, I bought the Fascination Tables. I was so thrilled that I saved the Fascination. I actually am so naive that I said to myself, when Walter and Cindy and Marty find out I saved the Fascination, they're going to be thrilled. I worked all day finishing, taking apart the cranes. Then I started on the Fascination. I started at 8 o'clock at night. I worked all through the night till 8 o'clock the next morning. Within 12 hours, I had all the heads off the machines and half the bodies off the legs. Nobody could have done that. I did that. Why? because anybody else who bought the Fascination would not have any idea how Fascination works. They would have tried to mark and identify every single wire that was running from table to table through the floor. They would have tried to mark and document everything to have any kind of chance to put it back together again. I don't need any of that. I cut the wires right at the tables, because if I set it up again, I'm going to put new cables. It meant nothing to me. I didn't need to identify any wires because I know every wire in every Fascination machine and its function. Nobody could have gotten that Fascination game out of that place within the time allotted but me. That might be the reason why the man defaulted. Maybe when they realized how long it was going to take apart, they realized they're not going to be able to get it out in time. And maybe in hindsight, that's why Marty and Walter didn't bid, because they figured whoever bought it would never be able to get it out in time, and that they'll get it in default for free. But I ruined that. I left so tired the next morning at 8 o'clock, I could barely walk. I went home to get some sleep. I figured when I get up the next afternoon, I'll go get a U-Haul truck, go over there, start moving some of the tables I took apart out, work on the rest of it. I drive over there. I'm tired. I'm swimming with my head. And I sit down in the Fascination, and I'm going to indoctrinate myself to where I left off. And then I noticed something. There had been an island of 8 tables in the middle, and I had all the heads and the bodies off those 8 tables. And under the 8 tables were coin retrieval mechanism systems. And I know they were there, intact, because I'm the one who removed the tables to expose them. But now, they're ripped apart, and all the parts are gone. I'm like, what is this? I'm in disbelief. I went out to the front where Jared was. I says, Jared, who was in there? He says, I didn't see anybody in there. He says, I've been here since 10 a.m. I says, well, I was still here till 8 a.m. What happened between 8 and 10? I said, are the security cameras still working? He said, yeah. We went down to the office to check the security footage. After I left, after 8 o'clock in the morning, Walter and Cindy came, and they used their landlord keys to enter the property. They didn't have the right to do that. They don't have possession of the property at this point. There's no emergency. The tenants have to let them in, but they didn't. They let themselves in. They went upstairs, and they saw the Fascination half taken apart. They must have had their jaws drop. Must have had a heart skip a beat, because the last time they were there in the evening, everything was assembled. Now they came, and it's all the heads are off. Major visual difference. They walked out, and they came back 5 minutes later. They brought boxes and tools. And together, they spent the next hour ripping the parts out of the coin retrieval systems that were now exposed. He's pulling them apart, wrapping them up, handing them to her. She's putting them in boxes. She's carrying them out the front door down to their van on the street. Like thieves in the night. Multi-millionaires who needed for nothing came back when nobody's there, using a pass key to rob the parts out of the machines that didn't belong to them, hadn't belonged to them for 10 years, and were just sold to somebody else who they thought was somebody in Ocean City. That started a whole chain of events afterwards, which is a whole nother video. We're not going to go into it right now. But I got the tables out, and I took them off the island, and I stored them near Atlantic City in a storage facility. A few years later, when I lost them all, and then I ended up over here, I decided to make this place about the history of Wildwood. I called it Tributes and Traditions, using the artifacts from the fun houses and the ride cars, from the piers that were. And I was going to put in a fascination. So I figured what better tribute could be but to use the fascination tables from Olympic that was here almost 50 years. I could have used my other tables. Would have been easier. They were better upgraded. But I used the Olympic tables because it was in honor and tribute to Olympic Fascination and their history, having been there all those years. And when I put them in, I had to upgrade them. I had to redo systems that were insufficient for my use. The Four Corners system that was first done as the most amazing thing on Fascination that I replicated in Keansburg the same year on my 1938 tables. After operating the Fascination the first summer, I found the Four Corners system had a defect. That it would ring off with only 3 corners under certain conditions. My Keansburg tables from 1938 didn't have a defect. These did. I had to fix the defect. I really thought Marty was going to be thrilled, Walter was going to be thrilled, but when I opened, they were mad at me. They were mad at me for getting the tables. They were mad at me for reopening the tables. I can't help that. I still tried to be their friend. Walter has since passed away. Marty's still around. I still talk to Marty. And he's been honest enough to say he's loved what I've done with the game and how I've upgraded it. I changed the coin collection system. Walter had made a coin collection system after he saw mine in Seaside, but he couldn't replicate the one I did in Seaside, so he made a solenoid system that you put your coins in a tube and the solenoid would knock one coin off as a means of collection instead of having an attendant. It didn't work right. It was problematic. Walter had to constantly adjust it. When Walter wasn't there and they sold it to the Dohertys couldn't deal with it and they pulled it out. They went back to manually collected. When I got the tables, they were still running manually collected. The first year or two, I had to run them manually collected until I had the time to build a new coin slot system, and I did it similar to what I did in Seaside and a little more complex because I put in automatic ticket dispensers. I gave 2 coin mechanisms and displays, one for quarters, one for tokens, instead of just one. So it's a deluxe system that I designed specifically for these machines. I automated all controls with remote controls so I didn't have to be in a control booth. The machines got a lot of upgrades and they work beautifully. And I'm privileged to have them here because of what they represent and the lives that were spent in the fascination business all those years, from Coney Island to Long Beach Island to Palisades to Olympic Park to Seaside to Wildwood. I've kept the legacy alive, and here they are at Tributes and Traditions. So there's lots of things I could say about the tables, perhaps in another video. This one's way too long as it is. But that's a long story, and that's how things become part of your collection. I didn't need an 8th set of fascination tables. But I bought them because I wanted to save the fascination machines. If they had been sold to somebody who didn't know about fascination, they would have been destroyed. If they were able to get them together and they saw how hard the business was to run, they would have discontinued it then, and they probably would have been destroyed then. But I kept them alive, and I gave them a new life. And many people are thrilled because they played them as a child here in Wildwood. And now they get to play with their children on the very same tables that they played over the years. So it's an amazing story about fascination, and particularly this set of fascination tables. And they have a special history. Special history, and a special history to me, because I did the right thing and I preserved them. What will happen when I'm not here? This is a problem. So we do the best we can as long as we can. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Main Street Randyland YouTube channel. Bye, guys.